CR101radio.com, podcasts, and more.
The Chalcedon Foundation presents the U.S. Constitution, Part 2, Part 9 of R.J. Rushdoony's lecture series, American History to 1865.
Now, the next clause that we're considering in Section 8 of Article 1, to establish post offices and post roads. This, again, has proven to be one of the dangerous clauses of the Constitution, in that it has led to socialism to a great extent. There is no reason why private enterprise could not operate the Postal Service more efficiently than the federal government. As a matter of fact, second-class mail now is being delivered much more effectively, and the only reason why it cannot deliver first class is that the federal government prohibits it. There are a great many organizations which will take care of the delivery of second-class mail today and do a beautiful job of it. Now, another aspect of this clause is that it permitted the establishment of post roads. Before the Civil War, one congressman after another vetoed this. One president after another vetoed any kind of legislation to establish post roads. They were afraid of it. They recognized the danger of it. And the congressmen who were for it were anxious to get federally built roads in their states, you see, at another state's expense. But the presidents saw it. I think John Quincy Adams was the only one who came close to favoring it. But the other presidents vetoed such measures. Well, you can see what it has led to. Today you have a federal highway program which goes into every state of the Union under the excuse that these are post roads. If the mail is carried over them once a year, why, that means the federal government has the right to build and to control that road and the surrounding roadside. It would be interesting to see how someone would deal with this with airmail taking over now. But at any rate, the air routes, I imagine, under the term of post roads today are subject to the same regulation. This, therefore, has been a very dangerous clause. However, the balance of this is very good in that it permits patents and copyrights. Here again, however, there is a problem in that this is being weakened progressively. A man should have property rights not only in landed property and personal property, but a man has property rights, really, in his ideas. And if you invent something, you should have a property right in it. Unfortunately, we are progressively weakening the property right in copyrights and patents. This is very dangerous for the future. Because one of the things that enabled this country to grow so rapidly was that Yankee inventiveness was one of the things that created a tremendous burst of industrial expansion. Well, now, why was there so much inventiveness? First of all, there was freedom. But second, there was property rights. If you are in the Soviet Union, what incentive is there for anyone to come up with a good idea when it doesn't get him anything? He has no property right in it. Some commissar over him takes over the idea, and then it's his property. And the result is he has no incentive to invent. For example, one foundation puts out a magazine, and it pays very well for the articles, but it has a ridiculous rule that no staff member could be paid, since he's already under salary. But what happens? Their staff members don't write articles. Why should they write articles for nothing? They're already doing work in the office every day, so if you write an article, you're not paid for it. And the result is they have brilliant writers on their staff who never write anything. No pay. You see, If you don't have a property right, if there is no reward for your labor, there is no incentive. So, the protection of copyrights and patents in the Constitution was a tremendous incentive to initiative and inventiveness. Section 8 then goes on to say that Congress has the right to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, make rules concerning captures on land and water, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, and now we come to something extremely important, to provide for calling forth the militia, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Now the word militia is a word that, like the word silly and farmer, has changed its meaning. And today, if you go to a dictionary, you'll find a great many meanings. But if you go to the historical dictionary and look up militia, you will find, if it's an unabridged dictionary that gives the history of words, that militia at the time of the Constitution meant a drafted army. A drafted army. Now, what does the Constitution say can be done with a drafted army? It can be put to only 3 uses: to execute the laws of the Union, that's the first. In case there's any serious problem, any disorders, any rioting, any violence, the militia, the draftees, can be called up to enforce the laws of the Union. Second, to suppress insurrection, rebellion, revolution. And third, to repel invasions. Now, this is a very important clause. It means that only volunteers can be sent outside the boundaries of the United States. The purpose of this was, and it was very important to men like Washington, they wanted a drafted army and the power to draft in order to defend the country, in order to protect it both from within and without. They did not want the United States to be involved in foreign wars. And in his farewell address, George Washington emphatically came out for what is now called, as an insult, isolationism. He did not want the United States to get involved in foreign wars and in foreign alliances, in foreign entanglements. He was radically against it, radically. And in the Constitution, this principle was written in. That is why, before World War I, in the 2 military actions outside of the United States, only volunteers were used. What were those 2? Yes. Which? Yes, the Spanish-American War. In Cuba and in the Philippines, during the Spanish-American War, the only troops that were used were volunteers. No draftees. They knew it was unconstitutional. Does anyone know? Now, this is a toughie. The other case before World War I where volunteers went outside of the country to battle. Yes, true. That was a volunteer army, and it went into Mexico. It started out by trying to defend the United States, but they actually went in, and they went in, you're right, so that's the second case. There's a third case, however. The Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, and what is the third? No. Oh, what? No, this doesn't apply to the Navy, because, first of all, the naval engagements, such as the Barbary Pirates under Stephen Decatur, were volunteers. They were not a drafted Navy. The draft was not applied to the Navy until very recent times. It was under General Pershing in the campaign in Mexico in 1913, I believe, to go after Pancho Villa. Yes. under General Pershing, they took volunteers into Mexico to go after Pancho Villa. Now, with World War I, Wilson demanded a drafted army to go to Europe. Immediately, great numbers of people filed and went to court on this. The court, however, was a liberal court that had been somewhat sacked, and so the court delayed on hearing all these cases until after World War I, and then they ruled against the draftees. So, in effect, they paid no attention to this. And in World War II, and Korea, and Vietnam, draftees were used outside the territorial boundaries of the United States. This, in terms of the Constitution, is illegal. So, without having any sympathy for the draft dodgers and the card burners and the lefties who were involved, we have to say that however wrong they are on what they believe generally, at this point, they were in the right. The government, in terms of the Constitution, has no right to do this with a drafted army. But it has been done now 4 times. World Wars I and II, Korea, and Vietnam. Then, at the end of Section 8, there is another clause which is very bad. Now, it was harmless the way it was written, but the Supreme Court has used it to grant vast powers to the federal government. Section 8 concludes to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. The great expansion of power has come through this so-called implied power clause, the last clause of Section 8, Article 1. Now, in Article 1, Section 9, we have some of the limitations on Congress's power. We won't go into too many of these, but one kind of limitation is very important to us, and we shall consider it. Many people have said that there was no Bill of Rights, so to speak, in the Constitution, and it had to be added to the Constitution. Well, a Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution to spell out some things that were not in the Constitution, and to make it clear to the people how strongly their rights were going to be defended, their liberties. But there were specific statements of rights in the Constitution itself. For example, in Section 9, Paragraph 2, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. Then later on, no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, except of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. In Article 3, Section 2, we have the trial of all crimes except in cases of impeachment shall be by jury. Such trial shall be held in the state where the said crimes have been committed. But when not committed within any state, that is on the high seas, the trial shall be at such place or places as the Congress may by law direct. Then in Section 3 of Article 3, it says the Congress shall have power to declare the punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of the person attainted. Now here you definitely have protection of the individual. He has the guarantee of trial by jury. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law can touch him. A law which is written after something and says something that happened before is a crime. Nor can his family be punished for his offenses. So there are definitely protections of the people in the Constitution itself. Now, in Article 1, Section 10, there are the limitations on the states. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver a tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. Now, sometimes you hear people say, well, it's only the states that are required to issue gold and silver. But we have seen this comes twice, you see, in the Constitution. First, Congress can only coin money, and now we are told that only gold and silver are legal tender, and no state can make anything else legal tender. Now, if in all the states of the Union only gold and silver can be legal tender, if some of these people who claim that Washington can issue paper money, even though it says coin money, they would then logically have to say paper money can only be used in the District of Columbia and nowhere else. However, in Section 10, the states are given the right to engage in war in case of invasion without waiting on Congress. But apart from that, they cannot engage in war. That right is reserved to Congress. Now in Article 2, Section 1, we have the Electoral College as well as the executive power of the President. The purpose of the Electoral College was to avoid the influence of Congress, to avoid too heavy an influence by voters at large, majoritarianism, and to avoid too great a control by the states. As the Constitution was originally written, what they expected Congress to do, or the states to do, was to elect electors to the Electoral College, one from each congressional district. Now, this is a very important fact, because it would mean that there would be two electors to the Electoral College at large, like the two senators. Then there would be an elector from each congressional district. Each electoral district would vote in the Electoral College just the way their district voted. So that in the early years of the Republic, it meant that, say, Virginia would vote for several men for president. Because from each congressional district, the men would vote in terms of their district and how it went. So that Virginia sometimes would cast votes for 3 or 4 different men for president in the Electoral College. And New York sometimes would vote for 4 or 5. But around the 1830s, the city politicians realized that they got laws through their various state legislatures requiring winner to take all, so that instead of each congressional district determining how their vote was going to be, the majority vote for the state would determine it. It meant that the big cities now began to control the electoral vote. So instead of all the electoral votes, say, of Virginia going to as many men as were voted on in the districts in terms of who won in each district, it all went to the one man who carried the state. Now, he might have carried the state by only 300 votes, but he still took all the electoral votes. Now, of course, this wasn't entirely fair. But even more, it put the power first in the hands of the big city voters, and second, in terms of special interest groups, minority groups. The first group to take advantage of this was the abolitionist movement. The abolitionists were one-issue voters. Their attitude was, you vote our way, they would say to the candidates, or else we will not vote for you. Well, since the election in many a state in those days was determined by, say, 10 or 20,000 votes, or 5,000 votes, it meant that 6,000 abolitionists in New York State, who might be only a fraction of the entire vote, could swing the vote between the Whigs and the Democrats. So that all the votes of the Whigs and the Democrats added up to nothing, and a handful of abolitionists were controlling it. because they were saying to the candidates, if you don't do what we say, we're going to vote for the other man. And so they would be the swing vote, and the man would say, all right, I will push for anti-slavery legislation, or for this or that kind of legislation. Now, to this day, this weakness remains because it's still a winner-take-all in every state. So it is not the majority of Republicans, it is not the majority of Democrats whose will is important in any campaign. It's the minority vote. It will be how the labor unions as a pressure group want the candidate to act, and how the colored vote reacts, or how, in some areas, it'll be the Masons. In other areas, it'll be Catholic. In some areas in the South, it'll be a Protestant group, say the Baptist. In other words, no longer is it the will of the people in a district, but the pressure groups that can exercise the swing. As a result, our government has been seriously out of balance. Majoritarianism has led to pressure groups dominating national elections. They have the swing vote. Every now and then they talk about reforming the Electoral College, but increasingly it becomes less and less likely because today we have so strong a democratic impulse, and the democratic impulse is on the part of the minority groups because they know in the name of democracy, the majority rules, they can have a swing vote to give the majority to whichever party plays ball with them. And the result is the country is in serious trouble because of this. Now, as we continue in the Constitution, and I'm not trying to deal with those things that I'm sure you have dealt with in your high school history, but in things that are not normally covered in a study of the Constitution. We'll skip through some of the passages because our time is very limited, and I do want to deal with as much of it as possible this morning, in fact, to conclude it. One of the interesting things about the Constitutional Convention is the extent to which Calvinism dominated it. There were 55 men in the convention. The graduates of Princeton, who were pupils of John Witherspoon, were 9 in number, the greatest single group. Yale and Harvard were more or less Puritan also. Yale had 4 and Harvard had 3. Columbia had 2, Pennsylvania 1. William and Mary had 5, 6, or 7. We're not sure about some of the men. 2 were from Scottish universities and were again Calvinistic. 1 was from Oxford, and 3 others had studied law in England. Thus, Presbyterianism and New England theology had a very heavy representation. Very heavy. The Constitution required ratification by state conventions of 9 states to ratify it. Now, it is interesting that one of the big arguments against ratification was for centralized power, and some were honestly fearful of it. One of the men who was very strongly against the Constitution we have mentioned, and that was George Mason, who wrote a great deal of it but left. Another was Patrick Henry. Both men liked a great deal in it, but they were afraid that more checks and balances were necessary, that the power of the government should have been even more restrained. Another man who was a member of the Constitutional Convention and left was Luther Martin. Luther Martin was a very brilliant man, but a kind of a difficult and bad-tempered person. He wrote an account entitled The Secret Proceedings of the Constitutional Convention and published it. I have a copy of it. It was for a long time rather rare, but now it has been reprinted. And Luther Martin pointed out that he was afraid that the new government was going to be too powerful. However, in spite of this, and there were real fears by many others that this was a danger, there was also the great danger at that time of anarchy. After all, they recognized, many of them, that Washington was right. But had it not been for Washington's heroic dedication, the entire cause of the revolution could have foundered. They could have gone down the drain, because they did not have a real and a functioning government. They needed one. As a result, there were a number to ratify. The small states, the weaker states, were the first to ratify. They felt the need of a strong federal union. Delaware was the first state to ratify unanimously. Then Pennsylvania was the second state, 43 for and 23 against. Then New Jersey was the third, unanimous. And then Georgia was the fourth, again unanimous. So the first four states to ratify, three of them were the weak, small states in population, only one big state, Pennsylvania. Then Connecticut was next to ratify, and Massachusetts. So they now had two fairly good-sized states, and Massachusetts the second largest. Then came Maryland, another smaller state, and South Carolina and New Hampshire. The vote in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire was fairly close. But with the vote in New Hampshire on June the 21st, 1787, the Constitution became operative. However, there was still some danger. Would it actually ever take effect? There were still four states that had not yet ratified. They were Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island. 5 days after New Hampshire ratified it, Virginia did by a very close vote, 89 to 79, after a long and a heated debate. It seesawed back and forth, and at times it seemed as though Virginia would not do it. And you can realize that if Virginia and New York had not, the new Constitution would have not gone very far, because here would have been two powerful areas. New York did not yet have the population, but it was strategically an important state. Apart from Washington, it would not have been ratified in Virginia, because Patrick Henry and George Mason were two very powerful and important men. And on grounds of conscience, they opposed it. Now, they both knew that they were paying a price for it. Patrick Henry, had he not opposed it, could have written his own ticket and been president any time. Even so, he was still asked if he would run, but he refused to run for office at all. Then on July the 26th, 1787, New York, by a vote of 30 to 27, again very close, came in. So on November 21, North Carolina came in. Rhode Island stayed out until the next year. The reason why Rhode Island came in was not because it wanted to, but because now it was a foreign country. And it could not ship anything across the borders to the other countries, or the rest of the United States, without paying a tax. So Rhode Island came in for business reasons. And the result was that now all 13 had accepted it. However, the Constitution had been ratified simply because in many states a Bill of Rights had been promised, as you probably remember. Now, as we look at the ratification, we have to divide the states and the reason why they ratified into three groups. There were 7 weak states that ratified readily and easily because those 7 states needed the Union. They could not stand alone very well. These 7 weak states needing the Union were Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Georgia, and Maryland. As a result, these states were very quick to ratify. There were, however, 4 strong states, which, however, were very weak because of the war and because of post-war problems. The war had hit them very, very hard. They had been very heavily invaded, or they had suffered serious losses through the war, and while they were strong states, they were very weak temporarily, and therefore they needed the Union. And this was an important practical consideration. These 4 were Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. Then there were 4 strong states who did not feel they needed the Union and only came in because it was so certain, it had been virtually ratified, that in fact had been, and so they came in. And these were New York, Virginia, Rhode Island, and North Carolina. Now, the Bill of Rights then were very quickly passed in order to emphasize that indeed they were concerned with protecting the rights of the people. It is important to recognize what these Bill of Rights include. Very briefly, we have only about 10 minutes, a minute for each of the 10. The First Amendment prohibits Congress to make any law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, this is very important. This was put in because the clergy demanded it in state after state. This is a point which many people today misunderstand. They say the Constitution says nothing about Christianity. Well, the point of it was they did not want any establishment of religion or any interference into religion by Congress. Why? Because at that time, every one of the 13 states was Christian. In 9 of the 13, there was an established church. They did not want Congress telling them, you have to be Episcopalian if they were Congregationalists. In Massachusetts, the Congregational Church was the established church in the state. In other words, there is no separation of church and state required by Congress, by the Constitution, except for the federal government. Their attitude was, well, if Maryland wants to be Catholic, fine. If another state wants to be Presbyterian, fine. Or if a state wants to say this county could be Presbyterian and this one Episcopalian and this one Baptist, fine. This is a matter for the states to decide. So, the federal government has to keep its hands off religion. This is a state matter and a local matter. They did not say the states could not have a religious establishment. Moreover, it is impossible to separate religion and the state. Why? For the simple reason that every law represents morality. It says, thou shalt and thou shalt not. So it is enacted morality. And all morality is an aspect of religion. So, every law order, every government, is an establishment of religion. Today, the established religion of the United States is humanism. The government schools are religious schools. They're teaching humanism emphatically. I made this point in my book, Messianic Character of American Education, and some women in California got busy. And they said, well, if this is true, then we do have an established religion in our public schools. And they wrote to the Attorney General at that time, whose name was Robert Kennedy, and they asked for an opinion. Well, they had to write a number of letters before they got an answer, and finally Kennedy said, yes, the public schools are teaching religion, they are teaching humanism, and it is a violation of the Constitution, but I'm not doing anything about it. So they wrote to the, he referred them to their own states and their own local courts for action. So they wrote to the Attorney General of the state of California, named Lynch, and asked him to do something about it. And he finally wrote and told them, yes, their case was legitimate, and the public schools were teaching humanism, a religion. But he said, if you don't like it, go to the courts about it. And they went to an attorney, and he said, well, the cheapest it would cost to prosecute to the Supreme Court, which isn't likely to pay any attention to you, is $100,000. It was 10 years ago. Today it'd be $300,000-400,000. So that's where the matter ended. But we do have an establishment of religion in the United States today. We have a humanistic view of law increasingly, and humanism taught in the schools, colleges, and universities. All this prohibits is Congress from doing it. Now, the Second Amendment not only permits the drafted army, but it preserves the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Again, they're infringing on this today. The third, remember we dealt with quartering troops. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. Well, no owner is going to consent to it, unless on a boarding basis where he controls it, so that wipes that out. Nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. So we've never had any quartering of troops. And the Fourth Amendment, against search and seizure apart from warrant. And only warrants to be issued upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or thing to be seized. The Fifth Amendment, of course, protects a person against unjust trial and says that no one can be a witness against himself. This comes right out of the Bible. Or can they be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or shall have private property to be taken for public use without just compensation. The Fifth Amendment has been much abused in recent years by criminals and communists, but it's still a good amendment. Because whether they are guilty or not, the Bible says that no man can be compelled to testify against himself. It requires evidence to be given by corroboration by someone who can produce evidence. You see, if you allow self-incrimination, then you open the door to torture, to compel you to testify against yourself. This provision against self-incrimination also means that your family cannot be required to testify against you. In fact, your wife or your husband cannot testify against you. And of course, this prevents the kind of horrible situation that you have in the Soviet Union, where they compel children to testify against their parents, or a husband or wife to testify against one another. The Sixth Amendment, trial by jury, a speedy trial, and so on. The Seventh Amendment, the trial by jury, where anything exceeds $20 in value. The Eighth Amendment, no excessive bail can be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. The Ninth and Tenth Amendments are very important and very much neglected. The Ninth says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. In other words, express powers is the doctrine of the Constitution. The federal government has no power except that which is specifically granted. There is no implied power doctrine. This is spelled out in the Federalist Papers as well as here. The 10th and last amendment of the Bill of Rights. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. In other words, unless the Constitution says that this power belongs to the federal government, the states and the people have all the powers they did before the Constitution. We have time now, about a minute and a half, 2 minutes, for a quick question or two. Yes. Yes. A speedy trial, that's a good question. A speedy trial means that the kind of thing that sometimes happened in bygone days, where a man was thrown into jail when they knew that he was innocent, and a jury would release him, and kept there year in and year out. Well, today, because of the congestion of the courts, men are very often denied a speedy trial. And so there's a great deal of concern about this and some action being taken. This is extremely important. Because supposing you are arrested and your bail is set so high you cannot pay. And you see, it forbids excessive bail. And they simply defer having a trial. You can sit in jail longer than your prison term would be if for one reason or other they postponed a hearing or a trial. And this was very commonly done once. Does that explain that? Any other question? We have time for one more.
How would back stoning to cruel and unusual punishment?
And going to what?
Would you prohibit stoning of murderers by cruel and unusual punishment?
Well, of course, they didn't have that in mind. What they had in mind was tortures. Now, the Supreme Court and some of the liberals have seen fit to read that as capital punishment, which is ridiculous. They never intended that to mean capital punishment. What they did bar were tortures. Well, our time is up. And tonight we will turn to de Tocqueville.
This has been a Chalcedon Foundation production, produced by Grace Community School and Nicene Covenant Church. If you enjoyed this lecture, be sure to visit chalcedon.edu for more lectures and series by R.J. Rushdoony and the Chalcedon Foundation.